Try to.
Can't put brains where they are.
Yeah, I can't put brains where they are.
No.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of History in a Drink. I'm Sean.
And I'm Frank. And tonight we're going to be talking about a historic Sarasota icon that is no longer here.
Yep. So, and this is kind of my fun episode with Sarasota history and being here my whole life. We get to talk about an old hotel, which is pretty awesome. So, but we need to start with a drink. So, and we've got our drink for the evening that we're going to be making. Now, our hotel we're going to talk about was really back in the 1930s and kind of the heyday of Sarasota and the opulence and the peace. So we're going to make a drink that was one of the most common drinks back in the 1930s in bars and restaurants that you would go to, and it became known as the French 75.
Exactly. And the French 75, it's named after cannons, the French 75 millimeter cannon that was used in World War I. And it was an anti-personnel cannon, and it was something that the Americans adopted when they went over there and began to fight.
And this particular drink, it actually was created in 1915. Was known as, and there's a bar actually in Paris called the New York Bar. And it was created there by a bartender. And what happened was, after World War I, so many Americans had been over in Europe in that piece that it kind of slowly migrated on over. And this was before the days of internet and easy communication. So it took a little bit of time to where it actually became popular in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. So that's the drink that we're going to make. And like a lot of drinks in the 1930s and 20s, it is a gin-based drink. So what we're going to do, for anybody making it at home, it's actually going to be made with, each one is going to be made with 1 ounce of gin. I'm making 2 at a time here. It's a very simple drink. Then it is a 1/2 ounce of lemon, plain lemon juice. We're going to add that into the mix. A splash of simple syrup. And then that goes over some ice. And we're going to take and shake that on up. Now, this drink became popularized in a lot of pop culture.
Exactly. It's most famous for being in one of the greatest movies of the 1930s, Casablanca. And when you watch that movie, you're going to hear them, what's his name?
Humphrey Bogart.
Thank you. Mr. Bogart asked for a French 75 in the bar in Casablanca. So I think that's a really kind of cool idea as you see it, that it permeated so far into culture that it was in the movies. And
here is, once again, to go back to a French drink. So we start with the gin and the lemon juice and a little bit of simple syrup, and that's one part of it, and then it's 2 parts champagne. So it seems like champagne was kind of a common theme in there. Garnish with a lime wedge.
A lemon wedge.
Or lemon wedge, I'm sorry. We're sticking with lemon. Dun, dun. And that makes us a French 75.
Cheers.
Cheers. Here's looking at you, kid.
That's right.
So, excellent little reference for a movie there. All right.
It's a good thing Bob understood it.
Yes, exactly. So while we're talking about the 1930s and kind of the opulence and peace, and we're still sticking with our Florida and specifically our Sarasota history.
Yeah.
I want to tell you about one of my favorite historical buildings in Sarasota. Back then, growing up and kind of knowing Sarasota's history, was commonly known later as the Ringling Hotel.
And that's how I've only known it, because my wife and my in-laws have always talked about the Ringling Hotel and going there for parties and stuff like that, but it never existed when I was here.
Exactly. So, but it actually had a little bit of a different start to it. So, Sarasota really had 2, I would call, founding fathers that really that grew the modern age of Sarasota, and that was the one everybody knows about, John Ringling, but then also too Owen Burns. So Owen Burns was a developer that came here from Chicago and moved down here. Loved Sarasota. This is like 1910 now that he actually ended up coming down.
Do you know who he influenced to come down here with?
Who?
Miss Palmer.
Tied her to Chicago.
Because he was advertising in her paper.
Yep.
That's why she came down here.
Well, he came down for the fishing and that piece.
Yeah.
While down here, he actually met and ended up marrying another socialite who was down here visiting, and they actually then came and settled in Sarasota, and her name was Vernona Hill Freeman, and then became known as, obviously, Vernona Burns. Owen Burns was really, though, focused on developing not just real estate in his pocketbook, but also to the community itself as a whole. So he would do sidewalks, he would pave the streets, he would, there's lots of different things that he was working on and doing.
I believe one of the things that I read is he was really instrumental in the creation of the courthouse district.
Correct, absolutely.
And creating the Terrace Hotel.
Yep, he was that too. And then the other piece was what was known as the Broadway district, which was then where the Ritz-Carlton currently is and where the 41 Strip is down through kind of that heart of downtown Sarasota. So Owen Burns, though, what he was most famous for was he teamed up with a local architect, Dwight James Baum, who actually was famous prior to this because he's the guy who designed and the architect that helped build Katazan, which was Ringling's residence. Now, Owen Burns and Ringling were kind of good buddies. They kind of had a lot of projects together. They worked together. Things were kind of good with them. Owen wanted to build a hotel, and he wanted to build the most opulent, beautiful hotel really in Florida. I mean, he had been to Miami, he'd been to Tampa, he'd seen things, but he wanted Sarasota to be just the centerpiece of that. We had the Opera House, he wanted to be culture and be that piece. So he worked with Dwight James Baum, and they ended up building they started in 1923, and it took 3 years to build. And so they actually, in 1926 is when they finally opened it. And it became, he actually named it after his wife. It was El Vernona Hotel. And it was a Spanish architectural style hotel. And in fact, it was, or Mediterranean revival style, but it was called by all the architectural, people of the day as the finest example of Spanish architecture in all of Florida. So just absolutely stunning building and construction.
And I've looked at the pictures of it and stuff like that, and it really surprised me of what it looked like because it was very boxy, and it had a courtyard in the center that you couldn't see. And it really reminded me of a ton of that Spanish architecture that we look at, all right? Like in the Southwest and stuff like that with those big open spaces. But you can't see that from the outside, and that was one of the things that really surprised me.
It also had these big, huge open dining and ballrooms. And obviously the rooms, lots of open hallways. Everything had that wrought iron metal in the outside balconies and wood. He had artisans come in actually from Cuba who came in and did this very elaborate stenciling on all of the exposed beams and pieces, all painted. It was an absolutely stunning building. And I encourage anybody, go ahead and Google what's became known as the Ringling Hotel. We'll get to that. But you can Google it and take a look at some of these pictures of just how stunning it was.
Now, to go off a little bit on that idea of stenciling on the beams, if you go up to Tallahassee today, in the park that's outside of Tallahassee, the state park there, they have a Wakulla Springs, and there's an old hotel that's there that has the beams painted just in that fashion as well, and it's from that similar time period.
Yeah. So a little bit back to the story. So El Vernona actually opened up. He had the grand opening for it on December 31st of 1926, and so it was a super opulent ball. Anybody was there for New Year's Eve, and that was his grand opening of the hotel. Hotel was, like I said, it was known as, in a newspaper article, the aristocrat of beauty. It was just a stunning piece. Going now that history, hindsight's always 20/20. Looking back, this was opened in 1926. 1929, we see the stock market crash, and we see huge things, and especially what went horrible was the land boom in Florida just busted out. And unfortunately, Owen Burns was tied very closely to that.
Because it wasn't just the hotel.
Yeah.
He had investments out on St. Armand's Circle and all over the place.
Correct.
In Sarasota.
So it was a tough thing that he actually ended up losing the hotel. Now, here's where it gets a little bit kind of crazy. So he actually lost the hotel. The hotel was going to be turned over to the bank, and someone who had invested more in cash-based things, who was actually his buddy, swooped in and bought the hotel, and that was John Ringling.
Yeah,
so
kind of a dick move.
Kind of a dick move. So he came in and he bought his friend's hotel that the friend named after his wife, and John Ringling immediately changed the name to the John Ringling Hotel. So now, and he brought with it his sense of showmanship, and piece. They have this big giant 2-story open ballroom in the center. They would actually have trapeze artists working in there, and that. So he brought a lot of his circus mentality to this, but it's still maintained to be this opulent hotel.
But karma is a bitch, because
a bitch.
When John Ringling died in 1936, he only had $311 in his bank account.
Yeah. So that's how things kind of work around and come around. So in those early, like I said, 1930s, from the 1929 to 36, this was his hotel and his piece, and that was really the height of this structure in this building. Kind of after Ringling died, and that when we got it stopped really being a hotel in the 1940s, and we had World War II came through and other things. So things kind of changed and weren't really a big.
Wasn't it an apartment?
Then it actually changed to the name changed to the John Ringling Towers, and what they did is they actually turned them into apartments. Okay. And so the ballroom still got used, and there was actually a bar downstairs that then became kind of a bar restaurant that still maintained its own separate piece, but then the rest of the place then became apartments. So, and it stayed that way up until almost the 1970s, and then it just went into really disrepair, and it was just kind of left and ignored, and just became this unfortunately very decrepit building. It still had incredible bones and structure in the building, and it still had this this facade, which once again I encourage everyone to go take a look online and look at the pictures. But it really kind of went downhill, and actually in 1984 is when they really said, they put the signs up, no trespassing, no anything, that it was really in shambles, and that it really needed to unfortunately come down. And of which then it finally did in 1998. There was a huge push to try to save the building. There was a huge push to try to, for the historical level, and it actually became kind of a political battle in Sarasota here, because there were people that wanted to save the building, but like most things, the land was actually worth more than the building and the history was.
Well, and the unfortunate part of it is that land over there seems to be cursed, because it gets turned into something, and then it's there for like the quay for a couple years, and then it fails, and it just keeps
the quay was actually back behind it, so it wasn't actually right where the quay is. It's actually closer up to 41, where the Ritz-Carlton currently sits, which is it was torn down to then construct the Ritz-Carlton Hotel where it's at, and so, but it is kind of a weird piece of property and a weird thing, but. Once again, the land was worth more than the history and the buildings on it. So.
And that's one of the interesting things about Sarasota is so many of the buildings have this unique architecture to it, that there's a cultural part of the community that tries and save it. And we see that with one of the buildings they did save is Sarasota High School.
Absolutely.
And they've turned it into a art museum and art studios and stuff like that, and renovated it and raised the millions of dollars that it took. But
and how funny that it was actually an art school named after John Ringling that actually was the one that saved that particular
Ringling School of Art and Design. Or where I teach at Riverview, the original Riverview was part of that what was
Sarasota School of Architecture.
Thank you. And they wanted to save it, and there was a huge push to save it, but over time they had done and destroyed the things that made it really part of that Sarasota School of Art and Design. Right?
School of Architecture.
Architecture. Yeah.
So.
All right. So as we look at it, it's kind of fascinating to look in our community and see some of these old structures. And you were talking about Owen Burns.
Yep.
And we still see there's a part of Sarasota that is named for him.
Sure.
And
not only that, it's kind of a cool, because it's a little bit of an arts district. It's the Burns Court. When anybody in Sarasota that goes and sees that, there's actually a independent film theater there. There's lots of shopping, some really cool restaurants and stuff. It's still in his name. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I enjoy about Sarasota is we still have that art and culture that we can still go and see. And
in fact, I love that the Caragiulo family, Mark Caragiulo in particular, actually started a restaurant over in the Burns district, and actually is known as Owen's Fish Camp, which is one of the best fish places around. But good stuff.
So there's a little plug for you.
Yep,
So you
exactly,
need to
Mr.
give us
Caragiulo. We'll take some gift certificates to or just some drinks. We'll come and sit in the bar and oysters. Pick up oysters.
That sounds good.
So all right. So that was our drink for the night. Once again, the French 75, and hopefully you learned a little bit of history about Sarasota and particularly the Ringling Hotel and its story. I encourage you guys to go take a look at some of the pictures. Like I said, I wish we could have some more visual and stuff here to kind of see what it is we're talking about, but it was absolutely a stunning piece. And for those of you guys in Sarasota, if you don't remember it or were not here before, talk to some of the old timers here, get their opinions and get some ideas on it.
Yeah, my in-laws always talk about going to a New Year's Eve party at the ballroom and stuff like that in I think the 1980s.
Yes.
And just
which is kind of the late 70s, 1980s was kind of the last little hurrah for it.
So they just always talk about it and how much they enjoyed going to see it, and how sad it was that it got torn down. So, but there's still pieces of it all over Sarasota.
There is.
Because Sean here has built a whole bunch of furniture that used a bunch of the salvaged wood.
I may still have some pieces to it tucked away, saved, and I may even have my mother-in-law may actually have sitting on her mantle the original elevator pulley system for the top of the elevators that actually still says the El Vernona Hotel on the top of it. So it may
Why
be.
is that your mother-in-law's
I don't know.
house? Why isn't that with
question.
us?
I know that needs to be with us here. But either way, so little shout out to her that it's a little chunk of history we kind of have to hold on to.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we'll see you next week.
Absolutely.
And next week's going to be a surprise because it's going to be a surprise for us as well.
Absolutely. All right. So French 75s. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers.